Hello. This week we're going to be looking at some common ethical issues that you will be encountering in your human services career. Issues related to confidentiality, boundaries, and dual relationships. We're also going to look at some issues that we talked about last week in terms of informed consent and termination, and then also touch a bit on the issue of competence to practice. So by the end of this session and this course module this week, hopefully you'll be able to describe common ethical dilemmas present in human services practice and also explore ethical guidelines for resolving some common practice dilemmas. First, let's look at this quote by Frederick Reamer, who is a professor at Rhode Island College in the School of Social Work. He has a long history of working in the area of professional ethics. He's written numerous books and articles, and he was part of the task force that developed the National Association of Social Work Code of Ethics. And he does sometimes come to Seattle to do trainings around ethical issues. So what he says basically is that most social workers who get into trouble with ethics-related issues are not doing this willfully. Rather, these often can be described as mistakes. We all make mistakes, and we all will probably violate ethics at some point in our professional career. The best we can do is to educate ourselves, be conscious, and be proactive about thinking ahead to what ethical issues you might come up with in every given situation. We all have the possibility of slipping on the ethical banana peel. So learning about some of the ethical issues that we might encounter ahead of time is one way to help prevent that. So these are the common risk areas that I talked about and that we're going to talk about. We're going to look at them one by one. Competence, informed consent, confidentiality, boundaries, and termination. So let's first talk about competence. So as a helping professional, you should accurately represent yourself and your skills to your clients. And your agency should also accurately represent itself and what it has to offer and what it's capable of. It's not really okay to experiment on clients if you don't have the training to do what your client needs. Now, if you have been to some training and learned a new skill set, then of course you are going to be applying it to clients, but you should be doing that under close supervision. You should be keeping up with the research and literature around that area and continuing to get continuing education hours, which are both required in the profession and also ethical to do so. So if you are unable to meet your client's needs, another thing that you should do is develop a referral base so that you can refer clients to whatever it is they need. So some common violations related to competence are misrepresenting your qualifications or your licensure, practicing in an area which you have not been trained and which is outside your area of expertise, and not getting adequate supervision for your work. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about informed consent. And this is something that was in last week's course module. We want our clients to be fully informed about what they're getting into in a helping relationship with us and with our agencies. And the issue of informed consent relates to the ethical values of client autonomy and client self-determination. And informed consent is defined as the process by which we provide our clients with complete and accurate information so that they can make a knowledgeable choice about whether or not they want to enter into a helping process with us. We need to tell them what the intervention or the services are that we're going to be providing, as well as any possible consequences or limitations to those services. And related to informed consent is informed refusal, or the right of informed refusal. So if a client is mandated to our services, what is their right to refuse, and what are the consequences if they refuse, and what are some other options if they don't want our services? And here are some examples of informed consent violations. Failure to inform your clients about the goals, techniques, and limitations of the services that you or your agency provides. And failure to make sure that your client is giving their consent without coercion. So sometimes, for example, a parent might make a child or an adolescent come to counseling. And so it's up to you to ensure that your client is willing to be there. And sometimes that may mean that you help them to be willing to be there. But if, for example, an adolescent who is over the age of consent can refuse to have services with you, even if their parents want them to. Here's another example of failure to ensure that clients are mentally capable of providing consent. So you may have a client with developmental disability or dementia. It's still up to you to try to explain to the client the services at whatever level it is they can understand, even though a guardian may be providing that consent. And then failure to provide clients with proper written and verbal consent. And these are sort of both legal and ethical issues. Or the client's consent is based on not enough clear and thorough information about what they're getting into. So what should you include in the informed consent process? Now this may to some extent depend on your agency or your own practice and the type of work that you do. And this is not an exhaustive list. You see in your textbook that there's even more information about this. But at the minimum, you want to give the client information about your expertise and experience, your training, and your philosophy of practice. What services you can provide, what are the benefits of those services, and what are the risks of those services. And then what the helping process looks like, what your role is, what exactly you'll be doing together, what days you will be meeting, what hours, how long will the service be? Will it be for a week, for 8 weeks, for 3 months, indefinite? And then you want to let the client know how you'll be keeping records and who has access to those records, and what the limits of confidentiality are with those records and with your work with the client. And we're going to talk a bit more about that in a minute. And then what fees or billing practices may be involved with the service. What is the client liable for? What would insurance cover? What other coverage is available to the client? And then giving the client information about the right to terminate services. So I mentioned confidentiality just a minute ago, and this is related to the right to privacy that all clients and all people have, really. It's also related to the stigma associated with many of the problems that people seek help for. So mental health issues, chemical dependency issues, domestic violence. We want to ensure that clients, when they talk to us, that we will not be sharing what they talk about or what our impressions are of them unless it's absolutely necessary. This makes for a trusting relationship between the client and the worker. It allows the client to feel more free to work on the issues they came to you for. And confidentiality is not just an ethical mandate, but it is also a legal mandate. And there are many federal and state laws that apply in protecting the client's right to confidentiality. These are some examples of confidentiality violations. Disclosing to law enforcement or to members of the media about a client, and with the law enforcement, especially without a subpoena. Releasing sensitive information about HIV/AIDS or substance abuse. Disclosing information about a deceased client, or releasing information about minors to parents and guardians. There's specific rules around that. Sharing information with clients' family members or on social media, like say you had a bad day and you write on your Facebook page, "Oh, I can't believe the client I worked with today." That is certainly not okay. Disclosing information to third-party payers or insurers, and disclosing information in public areas or during a teaching or training or during legal procedures. Now there's many nuances to this, and the exceptions to confidentiality are also very nuanced, and we're going to talk about what those are in a minute. Let's talk a little bit about documentation and confidentiality. As I said, both federal and state laws apply to this. And the federal laws that apply are the HIPAA and high-tech rules related to privileged health information. And many human service organizations fall into the category of maintaining privileged health information on clients. So when you're thinking about documentation in your agency, you need to consider who has access to those records, how those records are stored. Are they locked? How many keys are involved? Who has the keys? How long do I need to keep the records and where? And what is the proper procedure for disposing of records? And not just considering the clinical case notes, but also any client appointment and billing systems or documents, and then also thinking about your communication with clients through phone, Skype, email, or text messaging, and how that may or may not fit into the rules of confidentiality. Now, the exceptions to confidentiality, and these are things that you need to tell your client about in the informed consent process. You need to tell them that you are receiving supervision or are part of a consultation group and that you may be talking about them with a disguised name with your supervisor in that group. If you are going to be sharing information about the client with other professionals within the agency or outside of the agency, possibly for a referral, you'll need to do that with the signed release of information from the client. If you perceive that the client is a danger to self or others, that is a reporting requirement. If there's suspicion of abuse or neglect of children or elders, that is also a reporting requirement. If you are subpoenaed to appear in court proceedings, that means also that you will have to disclose client information. And if you are billing or if the client has provided you with insurance, you may have to submit the client's diagnosis and their progress to those billing or third-party payers. Now, there's a particular legislation related to one of the exceptions to confidentiality, the danger to others, that you may have heard about or read about in the book. And that was a lawsuit by Tarasoff against the Regents of the University of California, in which it was determined that the duty to warn is not just to warn the authorities that someone is about to hurt someone else, but that the counselor also had the duty to warn the intended victim. And that is a law that's applicable in California, and other states have adopted the same law, but you'll need to find out if your particular state is one that has this Tarasoff law or not. Now, in terms of protecting client confidentiality, it's important, as I said, to discuss those limits of confidentiality when you're sitting down with the client and going over the informed consent process. Making sure that you have a safe storage place for confidential records, both if you have physical paper records and also if you have electronic records. How are those records protected? Be aware of the federal and state laws as well as any agency rules and regulations. And when you're writing case notes or making a referral, make sure that you're disclosing the minimum information required to provide needed services, to obtain consultation, etc. You want your notes to be clear enough that you would be able to follow them if you had to look back a couple years later, or if someone was filling in for you, but not so much information that it could become problematic to the client. You want to obey all mandatory reporting laws. And when you're thinking about electronic information, consider having encryption software to make that information safer. So let's talk about a typical confidentiality scenario. And I think this is pretty common in both small communities, but also in large communities as well. So say you're on the street and you meet one of your clients with whom either you've been working with in the past or someone you're currently working with. If you greet the client, you may be violating their confidentiality. If you don't, he or she might feel ignored or confused or abandoned. And what about if you're with other people, say your family? If someone comes up and greets you and you say hello, and then your family asks, how do you know this person? What should you do? So, this can be awkward for both the client and the helper because you have to take care not to violate the confidentiality. A good rule of thumb is to let the client control the situation. If the client comes up to you, talk to them. If the client doesn't, ignore them. And then, if it's a client you're still working with, it's something you can talk about when you meet the next time. Now, as I said, the likelihood is larger in a small community where you might go to church with the client, live in the same neighborhood, your children might go to the same school. But it does happen in larger towns too, like Seattle. I have run into clients, former and current, riding the bus, walking down the street in Pike Place Market, etc. And then there's the possibility that you might see a client doing something they shouldn't be doing, like a client in your recovery program having a drink in a bar, or a client from your domestic violence shelter meeting with their abuser. So you need to think very carefully about how you're going to handle such situations in terms and maybe get some supervision around it. In this situation, you don't have time in the moment to follow a whole complicated ethical decision-making process, but it would be useful for you to plan out this type of situation in advance. In situations or settings where it is likely that you'll run into a client, if you know you and the client move in similar circles, or if you're living in a small town, it is definitely worthwhile to talk about this in advance with the client. To be proactive. How would you like us to handle this if we run into each other? And let the client take the lead in this situation. Now I'm going to talk about the most common, potentially most egregious of ethical issues, and these are boundary violations, specifically dual or multiple relationships. And this means that the helping professional is engaging in a relationship with the client beyond their helping professional role. It may mean that they're in a social situation, a sexual situation, hopefully not, in the same religious community, going into business, some kind of business deal together, perhaps in the same school, or with kids in the same school. So an example of this might be that you as a professor are providing counseling services to your student, or to their friend, or to their family member. Or it may mean that you're in a dual relationship with your colleague or supervisor or subordinate. And these can also be problematic. What's inherent in these dual relationships is a conflict of interest. A conflict between your role as an objective person serving the client versus another role that might cloud your objectivity or your professional judgment related to the client. You have a lot of power, and clients trust you and consider you the expert, and you need to use that power and expertise wisely so as not to harm the client. You should not use your power to exercise undue influence on the client, to exert pressure over your colleagues or your students or your subordinates, or to have your personal financial interests clash with your professional interests. So Frederick Reamer, again, who we talked about earlier, and the article that we are reading this week is by him, has something to say about the distinction between a boundary violation and a boundary crossing. So boundary violation is overt, willful, and conscious. And it results in a dual relationship that is exploitative, manipulative, deceptive, or coercive. And it's characterized by its power to impair professional judgment or exploit and harm the client. And it's usually very clear-cut and something that you should never do. For example, entering into a sexual relationship with a client or a former client. A boundary crossing, on the other hand, is more frequent and is not something that is intentional, or that is inherently or willfully exploitive or coercive. It may be unintentional or unavoidable because of the situation in terms of the setting or where you live, etc. Um, and it doesn't necessarily end in bad results. It can have mixed results. Um, for example, self-disclosure with a client may have a therapeutic effect, though it should be used very carefully. Or attending a special life event of a client, like their graduation. Um, if your agency hires former clients as peer educators, or if you find out you attend the same church as a client. Sometimes these situations can be just fine and can work out well, or they could have negative consequences, and this is something you need to explore with yourself, with your supervisor, and with your client. So Bremer again in this article from this week has categorized boundary violations. And you can take a look at this chart in better focus in the article. So helping relationships are considered a one-way intimacy where the client shares a lot with you and you don't share a lot with the client. So this intimacy can lead to some kind of boundary violations. Sexual misconduct is a significant issue in the helping professions and the most frequent lawsuit that is filed against a helping professional. And I was surprised to read in the article that a high percentage, 8 to 12% of all male counselors have engaged in sexual relationships with a client or former client. I'm hard to believe that, and I hope it's not really true. It also could mean engaging in an inappropriate relationship with a client's relative, with their supervisor, with a student. And I think sexual relationships are the most damaging of all ethical violations in terms of client self-esteem and ability to trust. It is also considered a felony in some states, and all professional ethics codes have prohibitions against it. It's a pretty clear-cut no. There are such things as intimate gestures, such as gift giving, affectionate notes, forming friendships with clients, attending client special events. And these are a little bit more gray, though there are different rules, ethical rules around all of these. Having a relationship with a client where you personally benefit or get monetary gain. So for example, becoming a former student's paid clinical supervisor, being named in a client's will, selling a client your daughter's Girl Scout cookies, making some sort of bartering arrangement with a client where you'll provide them services if they paint your kitchen, referring a client to your husband's business, consulting with the client on his or her expertise. Say your client is a surgeon and you're going to get some free surgical advice from your client, getting rides from your client. All these are boundary violations. And then getting your emotional and dependency needs met by your clients or your subordinates. Needing to be a hero to save everyone else. Self-disclosure to a client to meet your own needs. These are all considered boundary violations. Sometimes altruistic gestures, generally trying to help but going above and beyond your role with the client. Hiring a current or former client because you want to help them out financially. Performing favors for clients outside of the helping role. And then there's unanticipated circumstances that we talked about. Meeting clients in unexpected places. I was a counselor at Hall Health Mental Health, and I was at the gym on campus, and I had just come out of the shower with a towel around me and walked right into one of my clients. And that made me really think that I should probably join another gym. So these are just a few more examples of boundary dilemmas. Your supervisor suggests, for efficiency's sake, having your supervisory meetings over lunch or at a bar. The client complains to you that her previous worker, who happens to be your supervisor, was just horrible, just didn't get it about cultural differences. A counselor at a group home is out enjoying a large cold beer at a local blues festival and runs into two of her teenage clients. A worker on a home visit to a client is greeted with a meal being prepared for them, and then the entire family ready to sit down and eat that meal with you. And these are situations that you need to figure out how to deal with using an ethical decision-making process. Sometimes you can anticipate these situations and figure it out in advance. Sometimes you need to do it on the fly. Sometimes you need to do it with consultation. So how do we prevent or manage dual relationships? The first is to be alert to the potential conflicts of interest when you first meet a client. Think about it in advance. Be alert to the possibility. And then, if you find yourself in some kind of dual relationship, ask whose needs does this relationship or situation meet. If it is not the client's, then it is a potentially problematic relationship. Consider the power differential. Clients are vulnerable, and they expect us to be the experts, and they trust us. We are responsible for these relationships, not the client. Consider the nature and duration of the helping relationship. Did you do an intake on this person 10 years ago, or have you had an ongoing relationship with this client, professional relationship? Ask, has the therapeutic relationship been terminated with no chance of returning? If you enter into any sort of dual relationship, is that there a possibility that the client could still come back and seek services from your agency? As I said, follow the ethical decision-making process. Bring it out into the open. Discuss it. One of the hallmarks of ethical violations is the worker's unwillingness to discuss it or bring it out into the open. So if you're feeling that, you can be almost sure that it's a problematic relationship. You need to consider cultural issues and how you manage things in relation to the population you work with. Sometimes accepting food or gifts is very important within a culture, or attending someone's life events. So you need to kind of balance that and have consultation again around it. Now, one of the, I think last week we talked about ethics within the stages of the helping relationships. And one stage in the helping relationship that can be particularly problematic is termination or ending services. Failure to follow widely used protocols when terminating services, especially if you're terminating against a client's wishes. Failure to consult with a colleague about a challenging termination decision. Failure to give clients advance warning of the termination. And failure to provide clients with referral options or information about how to handle emergencies. One gift that we can give to clients is a good experience with termination or ending a relationship. So good endings are very important in the helping process because we have clients that often have not had very good endings in their life. A good ending can enhance the therapeutic work and make it possible for clients to consider receiving help in the future if they need it. They can help clients to resolve other unfinished business or resolve previous poor endings. They can model and help clients to build skills in how to have appropriate endings. So don't underestimate the impact and significance of ending your relationship with your client well. And know the difference between abandoning a client and terminating services. You should be discussing the timeline of the services at the very beginning during the informed consent process. You are entering into a 1-month stay at our domestic violence shelter, and that is the length of time you are allowed to stay here. We will be working with you to help you find a place to stay, another place to stay within that time. Or you're entering into an 8-week chemical dependency treatment program, and then we'll be referring you to outpatient aftercare. So being very clear about what the timeline of the services are and continuing to bring that up throughout the time. We have 2 more sessions left. How would you like to spend that time? Involve the client in planning out the end. When your time is up, review, reflect, celebrate, provide closure, do some kind of ritual. Make sure you're referring the client on or going over the next steps for the client. So we've talked about a lot of ethical challenges that we will see as professionals. And hopefully in this class you will be developing tools to manage all of these challenges and more.